Started. Reminder, you've got homework due tonight by midnight from that fluids and electrolytes chapter, okay? So don't forget to turn that in before go to bed. Okay, so we go from the male system to the female system, and then the third part, the third of this unit is all of chapter 26, I think it is, development, how we go from single cell to complex newborn, and I shorten it way down. So we just look at a couple of key points there. So we don't cover all of chapter 27. Okay, so female reproductive system, again, similar to the male, we have gonads, external genitalia, and then the reproductive tract. And then also we'll talk at the end a little bit about the mammary glands, since the purpose of those organs are to supply nutrition to the newborn. So it makes sense to include it in the reproductive chapter. So the gonads in the female are the ovaries, and they produce the germ cells for the female, which are oocytes, or ova, technically, by the time they are mature, as well as the hormones estrogen and progesterone. And we'll talk about where those hormones are produced as we get further into the hormone physiology. External genitalia, and then the female reproductive tract. These are the uterine tubes, which carry the ovulated ova from the ovary into the uterus. We have the uterus itself, which is the site of pregnancy, where maternal fetal nutrients and waste products are exchanged. More on that really in the last part of this talk when we talk about development. And then we have the vagina, which receives semen from the male. All right, so we'll talk about each of these in turn. One of the best views of the female reproductive tract is in sagittal section. Okay, so sagittal section separates into left and right. And, we see here's the pubic symphysis. Okay, so that's the pelvic bones coming around in the front where they're knitted together in the front. Behind that, we have the urinary bladder with its short, straight urethra that we've talked about before. We have the vagina behind that, and then the uterus. Now, uterine position varies. It's one of those variables in human anatomy. This is considered the normal, but that doesn't mean that's everyone. It's only about, I think it's 70 to 80% of women have a uterus that tips forward like this. Other versions of location are there's uterus that goes straight up and down, okay? And there's uterus that tips backwards so that the fundus, or the top part, is back here instead. And that doesn't normally matter. It can matter sometimes in pregnancy issues, though. But just so you know, there is variation in the position of the uterus. Coming off the side of the uterus then is the ovary. So the ovary is really on the posterior abdominal wall on the left and right side. So even though this picture shows a mid-sagittal section, it's showing you the ovary too, even though the ovary is actually further over here than our section shows. All right. So the ovaries and uterus, the classic example is, or analogy is, it's like a hand, it's like arms and a hand, right, holding the ovaries from the uterus. So the anatomy here is relatively straightforward. Okay, so we have ovary on both sides. The ovary is attached to the posterior abdominal wall by a ligament. That's this ligament right here, the suspensory ligament. And the uterine tube used to be called fallopian tubes. That's probably the term you all have heard in the past, but uterine tube is the proper name today. The uterine tube ends in a hand-like expansion that has little fingers called fimbria. So these finger-like pieces are fimbria. There's an expansion of the uterine tube just proximal to the fimbria. That's the infundibulum right here. Infundibulum just means wide part or wider part. And what they're showing you here is, this is what it looks like naturally. And you might think that the fimbria are attached to the ovary, when you see it in that, that appearance. But they've got a little retractor here pulling on the infundibulum to show you that the fimbria and the uterine tube are not actually attached to the ovary at all. There is a small space between those two structures. And that small space can matter clinically because it means that an ovum released from the ovary may not get into the fimbria at all and may end up escaping into the abdominal cavity. There are rare cases where a pregnancy will begin not in the uterus, but somewhere else in the abdomen. And that's because of this gap, between the fimbria and the ovary. Because sperm traveling this way can escape through that gap. An egg can escape through that gap. You get an egg and sperm together, and you have a blastocyst eventually that's going to try to make a placenta, even if that is not in the uterus. So you have those weird things happen. Even rarer, like extraordinarily rarer, those pregnancies can actually come to term, and you can have a baby in the mother, but not in the uterus. Now, don't expect to see that in your career. I mean, these are like 1 in a billion things that have happened once or twice, and somebody wrote about it, but you don't see those very often. Okay, so ovary, fimbria, uterine tubes. Ovulation typically occurs in the uterine tube, either up here in the infundibulum or in this path along here. Rarely does fertilization actually occur in the uterus, which is what people often think. Okay, so the uterus and the uterine tube share a broad, flat ligament, not surprisingly, the broad ligament that kind of connects this whole structure together. And then along this edge of the broad ligament is where the uterus then is attached to the posterior abdominal wall. So that's, this, well, you can't really see it in that picture, but this attaches to the body wall. So the uterus is held in place. All right, let me see, did I cover everything? The ureters come along behind the uterus and then curve forward to meet up with the bladder. I think I have a better picture of the uterus later, but the uterus is kind of funnel-shaped, roughly funnel-shaped. It has a kind of dome-shaped top called the fundus, and then the narrow end of the funnel is what creates the cervix. So the cervix is the part of the uterus that extends down into the top of the vagina. Okay, and then in the center of that extension is an os meaning hole. So the cervix has a hole externally and it has a hole internally to allow the menses out and to allow sperm in. Yes. Oh, I caught a hand. Maybe not. It was just a movement. All right. This little picture up here. The testis has this really complex organization, right? It has those wedges, each of which has really coiled up tubes, the seminiferous tubules, the rete testi, the epididymis, all that. The ovary has very little internal organization at all. So depending on when you look at the ovary, you may see any of a number of different structures, but generally speaking, it's very loosely organized. So it's kind of an unusual organ in that sense, that it doesn't have a fixed anatomy. And the reason for that is probably because of how the ovarian cycle triggers follicular development and then ovulation, which we'll talk more about later. But this is what the ovary looks like in cross-section. So, you have some structures here, but even these structures that you see are usually not all present at the same time. Okay, so depending on when you look at the ovary, it will look different internally depending on where the patient is at in the ovarian cycle. All right. Onward. Okay. So just like we talked about spermatogenesis and spermiogenesis in the male, in the female, the production of the gamete cell, the ovum, is called oogenesis, which is kind of a fun word to say. So you say both O's, or you can say oogenesis, but properly it's oogenesis. And it is still meiosis which happens in lots of different animals. But in the female, the timing is very different. So we have all the same steps, but the timing is different. And in addition, instead of in the male, we started with one cell and we got 4 identical cells out. Well, in the female, it's asymmetric too. So we start with 1 cell and we get 1 big cell and 3 little tiny cells. So they're not symmetric. Okay, so in the male, we get huge numbers of gametes formed all throughout life. And in the female, we have many smaller number of gametes. And strangely enough, all of those gametes are essentially formed before the baby girl is born. So all the way down to like about this level, all of this occurs before the baby is born. So it occurs during fetal development. So very different process. So the mitosis part up here and the meiosis 1, all of this happens before birth during fetal development. And then it finishes, meiosis 2 finishes 1 ovum a month, usually 1 ovarian cycle at a time. And what you'll also see is all of the resources keep getting given to just one of these cells. So we start with 1 oogonium, it divides. That primary oocyte forms a secondary oocyte by dividing. Well, what results over here is what we call a polar body. Essentially, it's a little tiny cell that has only the genetic material and nothing else. So it dies. It involutes, and the body recycles those parts. Then after birth, at the beginning of puberty, these secondary oocytes, then they divide, and we get a second polar body, which does the same thing. It kind of disappears. And the first polar body, technically it can divide. It does not always do so, though, because it doesn't have the cellular equipment to do that. So instead of getting 4 identical cells like we did in the male, we get 1 giant cell for each oogonium. So we have an oogonium, a primary oocyte, secondary oocyte, and then eventually the mature ovum that occurs with each ovarian cycle. So very different pattern than the male. The mature ovum is one of the larger cells in the body because essentially it has all of the cellular stuff of 4 cells all jammed into one. So just like a chicken egg is actually a single cell before it's fertilized, egg cells are usually quite large compared to the cells of the other cells of an animal. And it's because the ovum has to sustain the developing embryo with resources it already has for about the first 10 days to 2 weeks before implantation occurs. So because of that, it has to be a massive giant cell, which is what it ends up being because of this asymmetric division. All right. So the female reproductive system has a number of different cycles that are all interconnected. Okay. The first, which drives the whole thing, is the ovarian cycle. So under the effects of changing hormones, the ovary goes through a cycle every 28 days approximately. Because of what's happening in the ovary, the uterus also has a cycle called the uterine cycle. That's commonly referred to as the menstrual cycle. So we have these 2 interconnected cycles. Okay, so in the ovarian cycle, this is all about the production of an ovum and then the preparation for pregnancy following that release of that ovum, which we call ovulation. All right, so the cycle begins here as what we call primordial follicles in an egg nest, which sounds kind of is just what it sounds. We get a couple of egg cells, those secondary oocytes, these guys. They're clustered together and in a sort of little nest. And under the influence of follicle-stimulating hormone, 1, sometimes 2, sometimes more than 2, but usually 1. One of those primary oocytes, actually they're secondary oocytes by this point, but that's okay, starts to develop into a mature ovum. As it does so, the tissue surrounding that primary oocyte starts to form what is called a follicle. Okay, a follicle is simply a fluid-filled hole or a fluid-filled space. So follicle-stimulating hormone, which we're going to talk more about later, transforms one of these primary oocytes into a developing follicle. Okay, so we call that a primary follicle. And that process continues. So as the ovum gets larger and prepares for ovulation, the follicle surrounding it also gets larger and more active. Okay, so the follicle produces estrogen. So this tissue here, this is the ovum, or what will become the ovum here, is developing into an ovulatable egg. Around it, we have the follicle tissue, which is generating estrogen. Easier to see here, I think, right? So we have this initial follicle development, and then eventually this process continues, and we get this sort of bubble or cyst-looking structure. Okay, so we have, this is the ovum here, and then all of this tissue here is producing estrogen, all right? Now, eventually, that ovum is fully developed, ready to be released. And this follicle that it's in ruptures, which you see here, and right through the side of the ovary, so right through the ovary's capsule, comes the egg that's released. So ovulation is the rupture of this follicle, which results in the release of this mature ova capable of being fertilized and capable of creating an offspring. So we have the primary follicle, secondary follicle. Tertiary follicle is what is this structure just before it releases. And then an event. So ovulation is an event, and the secondary oocyte comes right out through the side. So in many women, during the ovulation event, because the ovarian capsule is actually being ruptured in this process, there can be pain associated with ovulation. It's called Mittelschmerz. It's kind of a strange term, but it's ovulatory pain. Doesn't happen in all women. Doesn't happen with each cycle, but in many women, some cycles, there is pain with ovulation as this first ruptures and then has to heal because it causes some inflammation. But it's not done yet, okay? So the ovum heads into the uterine tube on its way to the uterus. Well, what's interesting is the follicle that remains behind, which ruptured and then healed, it transforms into a completely different structure called a corpus luteum. And this corpus luteum produces not only estrogen, like the follicle did, but it also produces progesterone as well. Progesterone prepares the uterus for pregnancy, for implantation of a fertilized egg and the beginning of pregnancy. So, we call pregnancy gestation, right, with a G. So progesterone is pro-gestation or pro-pregnancy. Okay, so progesterone is the pregnancy hormone, prepares the body for pregnancy. Now, if no pregnancy occurs, this corpus luteum eventually disappears after about 12 days. And as it shrinks and gets smaller, the progesterone and estrogen that it's making, the levels start to fall because the cells are dying off, and eventually it disappears, completely involutes, and that is what starts this whole cycle again. So in this picture, it's artistic license. They have put the different phases at different parts of the ovary. It doesn't really move like this. Like, you're never going to see all of these things at the same time. Okay, you're going to see it looking like this, and the rest of it kind of blank, like this. And then that's going to become this, so that you're looking at multiple time shots all in one picture. The ovary doesn't ever really look like that. It doesn't look like much. As you see here, this would be the most interesting thing you'd see under the microscope for the whole ovary, is what's happening in these follicles as they develop. Now, in the human, it's one at a time. In other animals, we get multiple eggs developing each reproductive cycle, which is not necessarily every 28 days. It can be once a year. It can be once every 5 years. For the larger the animal, typically the slower their reproductive rate. So, like, if you've been around a cat that's had kittens, there's a whole bunch of them, right? And there's a whole bunch of them because in the cat, many eggs are released at once, which is why they're not all identical. You know, they're brothers and sisters. So lots of different eggs, lots of different sperm. So you have a black cat and an orange cat and a black and orange cat, right? So, but in the human, because of the limitation of the size of the female abdominal cavity, the size of the pelvis, and the size of the newborn's head, we pretty much evolved to have babies one at a time. Now, we can have 2 or 3 at a time, but the risk for mom and the babies goes way up with each additional concurrent pregnancy. All right. Anybody a twin? No? So there's things about twins. All right. So some more detail about the uterus itself. This is all really important anatomy because, frankly, in the human being, because we are at a reproductive edge of sorts, you know, we have babies that are barely small enough to actually be born, right? Because, you know, we've got these big brains, which means a big skull, and we have, because we're primates, we have relatively narrow trunks and therefore a very narrow birth canal. You know, the birth canal is only about 10 centimeters in diameter. So it means that reproductive problems happen commonly in the human being. You know, so in a group of 100 women, you know, 2 or 3 of those will have had treatment for some reproductive system problem at some point in their life. So they're very, very common. Which means that the anatomy here comes up often in your patients. Okay? So much of this we've already talked about. Broad ligament attaches everything. Here's the ovary, fimbria, infundibulum, uterine tube. Now, the uterus has multiple regions. Okay, so the top dome part of the uterus is called the fundus, of particular interest when a woman is pregnant. So the fundus, as the fetus gets larger, the fundus rises, right? It comes further and further up into the woman's abdomen. So one of the things that the obstetrician follows is what we call fundal height, or how tall the uterus is. You know, you feel for the top of the uterus, and you make a measurement down to the pubic symphysis, and that shows that the baby is growing, right? Nice, simple approach to that. So the uterus has a fundus. Its body is this sort of funnel-shaped region right here, changes dramatically in size with pregnancy. I'll show you all of that later on in this chapter. And then the cervix, like I said, is the part of the funnel that extends down into the top of the vagina. Okay. The wall of the uterus has basically 3 layers. The perimetrium is the outermost layer. It faces the abdominal cavity, the pelvic cavity. The myometrium is the thick muscular layer here. And then the endometrium is the inner lining of the uterus. And the endometrium is hugely important because it's where the placenta is formed. And it's where mom and baby's circulatory systems meet during pregnancy. It is the endometrium that grows, changes, and then sloughs off, which creates the menstrual cycle. So the endometrium is a tissue in the body that gets a lot of attention in clinical practice because many things go wrong with it. Frankly. So all told, the uterus, the non-pregnant uterus, is very, very small. You know, it's about 4 centimeters tall, about 3 centimeters wide. So it's a teeny tiny thing. You know, when we look at these pictures, they're hugely blown up. The uterus is super small. Now, what's amazing is in pregnancy, it changes its size just hugely. I don't know what the number is, probably 10,000 times or whatever bigger. I mean, it gets much, much bigger than it usually is. Ultimately, the uterus evolved to house a pregnancy, and then the myometrium's role is at the end of that pregnancy is to evict the baby, right? Is to push the baby out through the birth canal using smooth muscle contraction. All right. So down here in the cervix also comes up clinically a lot because it's the site of a particularly nasty cancer, cervical cancer. And because it's a particularly nasty cancer, because it doesn't give much symptoms until it's far advanced, we sample the epithelium of the cervix. That's a pap smear, right? A little brush is used to pull off some epithelial cells from the cervical area and some other tools are used to scrape a little epithelium off the cervical epithelium. Look at it under the microscope, make sure all the cells look normal, right? Because if the cells don't look normal, it suggests that some of these cells that line the cervix may be becoming cancerous, and that's cervical cancer. Used to be a big killer of women. That number has gone down dramatically since the Pap smear was invented. Some of the causes for cervical cancer are also still being addressed. There's a virus called human papillomavirus, which is technically a sexually transmitted disease that dramatically increases the risk of cervical cells becoming cancerous. So today there's a vaccine for that. It's called Gardasil. Many of you will have gotten it or will have had it offered to you anyway. And it's designed to prevent cervical cancer in women by vaccinating both men and women against this virus that causes an increase in cervical cancer. So a lot has been done about this tiny little area of the body.
Question
Yes.
about that Gardasil.
Mm-hmm.
I know it should be given between 9 years old to 26. What if you had the vaccine after 26, like around 27? Will that work?
It would still work if you don't already have it. It's one of those viruses that it can be kind of ubiquitous. Yeah, HPV. So yeah, the vaccine will still work. The question will be is, have you already been exposed? Because there's other ways to be exposed besides sexual transmission too. Yeah.
Is that a series vaccine? The Gardasil, is that a series where they give you one and then another?
Yes,
Okay.
there's 3.
Like the hepatitis, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So what happens?
And right now it's pretty expensive,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Is it like in shortage?
No, it's because it's new.
Oh.
It's brand new, and any new medical technique, it's always expensive at first.
So with that one or any other vaccine that's like stepwise, what happens if you receive like 1 or 2 of the series, but not all 3? Yeah.
Good question. So each successive dose increases your immunity and increases the length of that immunity. So like with the first vaccine, you got some immunity, but it's gonna wane pretty quickly. It's gonna go away within a couple of years at least. The second one, your immunity is going to be more vigorous and it's going to last longer. The idea behind the third one then is to give you maximum immunity that will last maximum long time.
And they learn that through trials.
Huh?
They learn that through
Yes, they learn that through trials by looking at antibody response. Now, an important thing to know is some people think, well, I got the first 2, but I didn't get the third one, so do I have to start the whole thing over? Not usually. Usually there's a minimum length between the doses, but there's not a maximum length. So like if it says, you get 1 and then a month later you get another one, 6 months you get the third, and you go 6 months between the first 2, no problem. Your immune system will still respond like it would have at a month. So we encourage people to, even if it's been years since you had the last one, get the last one, because that last little boost of your immunity can last your whole life. Yes?
So actually, to the question, I read an article once in a magazine that said that the Gardasil shot, the first 2 is just as effective as 3, as long as you got to the second one. It was an interesting article.
Yeah. The third probably comes from past experience, because like we used to only give 2 measles MMRs, but there are enough people who don't get fully immunized after 2 that we just give everybody free. So it's probably that same thing. Probably 80 to 90% of people are immune after 2, but we want to get the 10% too, so that we have the herd immunity. But yeah, that's a good info. Other questions? No? Okay. Fundus, body, cervix. Yeah, that's all. Okay. Okay, so we zoom in now to look at the lining of the uterus called the endometrium. And the endometrium has its own cycle, okay? We call it the uterine cycle. The hormone changes that occur in the ovary, so first there's very little hormone at all. Then as the follicle gets larger, it produces more and more estrogen, right, until ovulation. Then it makes estrogen and progesterone. Then those hormones disappear as the corpus luteum disappears. Well, estrogen and progesterone have direct effects on the lining of the uterus, direct effects on the endometrium. Okay? The effect of estrogen is proliferation. That means cell division. Okay, so at the end of the previous uterine cycle, or ovarian cycle, the estrogen and progesterone levels fell because the corpus luteum disappeared. All right? That causes the endometrium to fall apart because without those hormones, there isn't support for the growth that has occurred. So as the endometrium falls apart, that creates the menses, right? So it sloughs off the wall and travels through the cervical os. So it gets very, very thin. So this is thin endometrium. This is at the beginning of now the next ovarian cycle. So that follicle starts to grow. Estrogen starts to be produced in quantity. Estrogen causes this thin layer of endometrium to proliferate, divide, get thicker. Okay, so it gets thicker and thicker and thicker. So we go from this at the beginning of the cycle to this near the middle. Okay? Then, as progesterone starts to be produced after ovulation, this thickened endometrium transforms into a much more glandular tissue. So there's a lot more secretion, there's a lot more carbohydrates, proteins, lipids are produced. So the thicker endometrium then gets much more spongier and much more receptive for an implanting embryo to create a placenta out of. Okay? So first we get proliferation, then we get transformation, so we get into the secretory phase. Then at the end of that cycle, the two hormones drop again, and the endometrium sloughs off. Now, one interesting feature of this is cells need blood to survive. Okay, so how do we have a tissue that gets thick and then falls apart and gets thick and then falls apart that can still have a blood supply consistently? Well, in come these spiral arteries. So these guys right here, when the endometrium is thin, they're kind of compressed like a spring. Okay, so same arteries, but they're short and not very tall. As the endometrium gets thicker, these spiral arteries uncoil and can get as tall as is needed for the maximum size of the endometrium. Then when the tissue starts to fall apart, they shrink back down again. So new arteries don't have to be grown every month. Instead, the existing arteries just expand and contract and expand and contract as the cycle goes through. All right. So this is kind of what that looks like in pictures. Okay, this is the uterine cycle. So this is at the beginning of the uterine cycle. So the menses has very recently occurred. This is myometrium right here, and this is all the endometrium there is right here, just this top layer. There is always some endometrium that survives the menses, okay, because that's where the next cycle is going to grow from. So we call that the basilar zone. This is the part of the endometrium that doesn't slough away. This is the part that's going to be there to grow for the next time. So the myometrium is muscle, and then this top layer is endometrium, very thin. Now, under the influence of estrogen, this basilar zone grows and grows and grows. So now, the basilar zone's way down here, and this is all new growth. Right? So pretty significant. We got this massive new growth. Myometrium is down here. So that's the proliferative phase. But it doesn't look like much. It just looks like plain cells that are kind of compact. Okay? After ovulation, when progesterone starts to appear, this thickened tissue that doesn't have much in terms of shape starts to get much more elaborate shape. So we get these little pockets in here. Those pockets are filled with nutritious secretions for what will be the fetus once it implants. So we turn from proliferative phase to secretory phase, and the character of the endometrium changes to be much more, to have more nutrients and more resources for the fertilized egg to implant. So the functional zone, which is what they're talking about here, that's the part that disappears or falls apart with each menses. So the basilar zone stays, the functional zone, first it grows, then it changes its character, then all of these cells come apart, and we go back to here again. So, and this whole cycle is driven by the changes in the ovary that we just talked about. That first estrogen is produced, then estrogen and progesterone, then both go away, and then the whole process starts again. Okay, so uterine cycle in 3 pictures. All right. So this is all anatomy that you should know. Most of this is anatomy you already know from previous classes, right? So the only points I'm going to make are note the position of the urethra, right? Here's the urethra. Many of you will either assist or put catheters into women, and the catheter tip goes here. Not here, not here, here, right? Yes.
So for the uterine cycle, when a woman is on birth control, especially like the birth control that, takes 3 months before you get your period, or like the UTI, what is it called? Yeah.
Oh, the IUD?
Yeah, are those
Not IUDs, those are things that go boom. Intrauterine device.
Yeah.
Yes, IUD.
Are the cycles just expanded then?
It depends on what the birth control is doing. And we're going to talk more about birth control later. But like the progesterone-only birth control solution, so this is the mini pill that's called Depo-Provera, where you get the shot that lasts 3 months or 6 months or whatever. That locks the uterus into this right here. So the uterus just stays like this until that progesterone level starts to fall, and then there's menses, so it falls apart and leaves the body. Now, IUDs work in lots of different ways, because some IUDs have hormones in them that come out a little all the time, so that can change the endometrium. Some IUDs don't, though. They work to block implantation so that the fertilized egg can't actually land on the uterus and produce an offspring. And there's lots of different ones, so it would depend on which kind. And we'll talk about some of the different options later on. Yeah. Strangely, the endometrium evolved for this. It evolved to grow and change and then slough off, and grow and change and slough off. So, typically in a tissue where this kind of thing happens for other reasons, it leads to a higher incidence of cancer, where you have a tissue that grows and then falls apart, grows and then falls apart. But you don't really see that very much here. There is endometrial cancer that occurs, but it's much less common than you'd expect for a tissue that's going through this pretty dramatic change every 28 days. And as mammals, the human reproductive cycle is quite short compared to a lot of other animals, where they have offspring every year, so they can only get pregnant once a year. They can't get pregnant every month like the human can. Okay.
Question.
Yes.
So how humans have evolved and grown over time, and they have a big
Gotten taller?
and height and such. Is there any difference in term of gestation based off of that?
No, if anything, it seems like our gestation is getting shorter instead of longer. Most of the change in height and size is attributed to nutrition, not to genes. So it's not that our genes are getting taller, they're just able to reach their full potential now because nutrition is so much better. But no, I'm not aware of any change like that. But, like in this country, babies born before term are very, very common. And it's, at least anecdotally, from a look, it seems like it's getting more common. But some of that is because we induce, for lots of reasons, so that makes babies early. We can take really good care of babies that are early, so they all survive, so there's a lot of other factors in that. But finishing the anatomy, okay, mammary gland. This is anatomy you may not have heard about before. So the breast exists outside of the muscle coat but inside the skin coat. Okay, so this is the pectoralis major muscle, the most superficial muscle of the anterior chest. Okay, so just to give you a scope, a point of reference, that's this. Attached to that pectoralis major muscle are all of these ligaments, these suspensory ligaments are kind of interwoven into the fascia that covers this pectoralis major muscle. So essentially, they provide the scaffolding to give the breast shape. So the breast is held up here by these suspensory ligaments in the pectoralis major. Now, in the non-lactating breast, non-pregnant breast, these structures do not exist. These lobules, which is where the milk is actually produced, grow only in the third trimester of pregnancy and then are maintained as long as the breast is emptied regularly. In other words, as long as lactation is happening, as long as the baby continues to feed from the breast, these lobules are maintained. So technically speaking, the breast is not a gland unless you're in the third trimester of pregnancy or you're lactating. Because a gland is something that produces a secretion, and the breast, the non-lactating breast, doesn't. It is just simply a fat structure with these suspensory ligaments and the delivery apparatus on the outside, the nipple and the areola. Okay, so the purple structures here only exist when milk is being produced, or as the breast develops into that in that third trimester of pregnancy. So there is multiple radial, in other words, they go out like spokes of a wheel, of these lobules, where is it? Yes, the secretory alveolus, that's these little balls here. Alveolus is grape. So do you see how that kind of looks like a bunch of grapes, right? And these alveoli are separated into lobules. So you get multiple mammary glands. That's each of these would be considered a mammary gland, or the whole thing would be. So the milk is produced in these structures. There's a duct, the lactiferous duct, that connects to a sinus. Sinus is just an expansion. Okay, so just underneath the areola are lactiferous sinuses, and then multiple ducts all enter in the region around the nipple. Okay, so many of us are familiar with feeding a baby from a bottle, right? A bottle usually has one hole for the baby to pull through. Very different than the breast. The breast has lots of little holes for milk to come into the baby. So don't think there's one hole in the middle, because there's not. There's many ducts open onto the surface here. And so milk is produced here, and then shuttled here, and when the baby feeds, through the many openings of the nipple. Now, one of the other big differences between how the breast works and how a bottle works is the breast does most of the work for the baby. The bottle, the baby has to do all the work. Okay, so the bottle is a passive thing. For a baby to get milk out of the bottle, they have to pull, right? They have to create suction and pull that milk out. Well, in the process of breastfeeding, these lobules and secretory alveoli contract, so they actually push milk towards the baby. So the breast does the work. Baby starts to feed, the breast starts pushing milk at the baby. All the baby has to do is swallow, pretty much. So, there's lots of benefits to breastfeeding over bottle feeding, but one of those is that the mammary gland, because of its contraction ability, when oxytocin is released, it makes it much easier for the baby to swallow. It also means baby swallows less air, okay? And air makes babies crabby because their bellies get big and it hurts and they cry. And when they cry, they swallow more air, which makes them cry more, so they swallow more air, and you get sense, right? That's one of the big causes for colic. Many of you have taken care of a baby between 4 weeks of age and 8 weeks of age. There are little tears. It's a test of parental love of the child, because you just want to give it to somebody else for a while. And it's because they swallow a lot of air at that time. So that's one of the benefits, is baby swallows less air. Another benefit is the baby it can take as much milk as they want. The breast adapts to the baby's appetite. Okay, so the more empty the breast is, in other words, the more hungry the baby was, the more milk the breast makes next time. So there is, as the baby gets older, the breast produces more and more milk. The milk formulation also changes as the baby gets older. So as the baby's needs change, the breast milk changes. So one of the things you have to oftentimes help patients with is telling or describing the difference between how the bottle works and how the breast works. And if you've breastfed or seen breastfeeding, sometimes the breast is so good at pushing milk out towards the baby that the baby's like drowning. There's milk coming out everywhere. So it's a very effective system. Let's see. Questions about any of that? There's usually questions about breastfeeding, yeah.
How does it know to start pushing the milk out?
It's neurologic. So it's wired up to the brain. Oxytocin, remember, comes from the neurohypothesis. So it's sound of baby, touch of baby, smell of baby, baby at the breast, all of those send signals because the brain's aware of those things. And it triggers oxytocin to be released, which pushes milk out towards the baby.
So you mean even like the mom seeing the baby?
Yes.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, if you talk to moms who've breastfed, there are these wonderful inventions, they say, that are called breastfeeding pads, which go in front of the nipples when the baby is somewhere else. Because what happens is mom will hear a baby cry, and breast starts pushing milk out, even if mom's shopping, going to a movie. Yeah. Yeah, they put pads in to absorb the milk in case that does happen. Now, remember, because it's a neurologic thing, it gets smarter over time. So, like an expert breastfeeder, she's had 4 babies, breastfed them all for a year. By the 4th one, the brain knows just when to turn it on and just when to turn it off. Too,
so it's like somewhat of a reflex?
Yes.
So it knows when to stop when the baby pulls away?
Yes. It also knows when it's about empty, when the breast is about empty and it slows down. The more vigorous the baby is, the faster it pushes it out. So, yeah, it's far more complex than the bottle is. Yeah. Yes?
Are we going to talk about how milk is produced?
We are not going to talk about how milk is produced. It's essentially, it is produced from stuff that's found in blood. So carbohydrates are made, proteins are made, fats are made, and then they're put into the milk. And the principal carbohydrate in milk is lactose, just like it is in cow milk. Its epithelial cells do this. So basically, a secretory alveolus looks like that. And these are all epithelial cells around here, right? And blood's out here. So they produce milk and they secrete it into these open spaces. That's one of these. And then these open, so they fill with milk in between feedings. And then they contract, these same cells contract, push milk out towards the baby, emptying this, and then they fill back up. That kind of answers your question. All right, that's all we have time for today. Bring your thinking caps next time because we have this monster and this monster to spend most of our time on next time.